Hey guys, so Bombhard here. So what I'm going to be working on today is a knife out of a Farrier's rasp. So what I've got here is a Heller horsehoof rasp. So you got kind of a more traditional double cut file on one side and then these big old teeth on the other. And so my grandpa showed me this newspaper story about some gal named Chelsea Miller who makes these real expensive chef's knives out of these rasps. And so what you do with them is you can grate cheese on this toothy side. So he asked me to see if he could make him a knife like this, and so I want to give that a shot today. So I don't know if she's grinding or forging, but with forging out something like this, I want a little more width, and obviously you're gonna have to sacrifice some of these teeth, but I want to preserve as many of these as possible so it'll be a good cheese grater. So the trick here is going to be working just the one edge without messing up this, and then without getting a giant curve out of the blade as well. So we'll see what I can do. So I'm gonna get the forge fired up and I'll get going on this. Okay, so here we go. I started out with my lighter 2.5 pound hammer just because I wanted to make sure I had a little more control. What I'm working on here is the tang. I'm trying to extend the existing tang of the file. I'm just sort of using that as a jumping off point for the knife's tang. You can see I quickly switched to the heavier 4-pound hammer that I made, and it really does do a good job of moving that steel around. And you can see what the anvil is doing. So one of the big things I learned while working on this knife is just the power of the anvil. So where I'm striking the top of the knife there, the bottom of the knife where it's in contact with the anvil is the side that's moving the most. Like, you're still moving a little bit of steel on the top there, but on the bottom where you're doing the step down for a tang or a ricasso, that's really where the most movement is happening. So I got the tang pretty much sized the way that I want it. I'm going for a hidden tang, but I don't want it too small. It's still got some beef to it. You can kind of see the little cracks from where the two step downs that I was forging, where they kind of met together in one thing. So, potentially that could be a weak part of the blade, but for this project where it's going to be encased in the handle, it's not really going to be a problem. So I did leave those in there. So here I'm drawing out the width of the blade. So I'm really trying to just move the material on that one side of the rasp so that I leave the teeth preserved on the other side. So I'm holding the side that I'm trying to work over the edge of the anvil, but you can see it's got, it starts curving because I'm only working that one spot. So I'm trying to straighten it back out without damaging those teeth. And I'm back to the lighter hammer just to give myself a little more control. It really did a good job of creating the edge bevels where I wanted them to be. You can see that as I'm drawing out the blade, it creates all these little bulges, and it's not a very even blade, and I can straighten that up on a grinder, but you save yourself a lot of time grinding if you try and keep that as even as possible in the forging. So here I'm using a 2x4, I think it's a piece of oak, trying to use this piece of wood to straighten out the blade without damaging the teeth or moving too much metal around where I have the shape kind of where I like it. Okay, so I don't need the whole file for this kitchen knife, so I'm gonna cut off kind of the top third there. So I used my chisel to kind of carve in some deep indents. I think initially I was planning on cutting all the way through the steel, but as it turned out, it was easier just to wedge it underneath the anvil there and break it loose by twisting it back and forth. And so here now I'm trying to draw out the tip, thin that down so that it'll be easier to grind in an edge there. So it's kind of turned into just sort of a tanto point. I didn't really want that. I was hoping for more of like a drop point, but that was a little more difficult to achieve, so I sort of left it as a tanto. Okay, so I got the blade shaped up about where I want it to be. It's got a nice little curve to it. So I kind of did some final straightening with my schwacking stick. So to anneal it, what I did is I put it back in the forge, fired it up so that the steel was hot enough that it wouldn't be attracted to a magnet, and then I just turned the forge off and let that blade cool down slowly and basically left it in there overnight. So I cleaned up the knife by soaking it in vinegar overnight, and so you can see it gave it this patina. That's the line where the vinegar ended, so that kind of took off most of the fire scale there. So now it's time to start shaping this up, and I'm going to be using my grinder for that. I started putting in the edge bevels right off the bat, but then I decided to switch over and true up that edge and grind where that final edge was going to be, just straighten that all up. And then for the tip, I didn't want to keep it a tanto tip, and you can see how ragged it was looking from where I cut it off. So actually it didn't take much time at all on the wheel there, and I kind of turned it into a drop point, kind of a machete style of rounded tip. Figured a mini machete for kitchen chores wouldn't be completely useless. And so for putting in the edge bevel, with the setup I have with the wood there, I was able to really lock the blade in and remove a lot of material with one pass. And so it kind of gave the blade a hollow grind. You can kind of tell by all the sparks that it's really hogging out a lot of material. And so to clean up all the big grinder marks, I got my Ken Onion work sharp with the grinder attachment and the extra rough belt, and that just sort of polishes the whole thing up. I was able to grind out a lot of little imperfections. And so while the knife is in this annealed state, I'm able to drill the pinholes into it. So I figured I'd get a little pilot hole going first and just lay out where I wanted those holes to be, and then drill them out the rest of the way. So if this knife was not annealed, it would be almost impossible to try and drill through that. But you can see it's doing a good job of boring through it. And then for a finishing touch, I just sort of took my files to kind of whittle down that final edge bevel a little bit more. You can kind of see it's still got a fairly thick edge. Wouldn't be able to cut anything right now. So for the handle of the knife, I'm going to use this log. I'm pretty sure that it's some sort of oak. I got this from a forest up in northern Michigan. It's got some, the area has some significance to the family, so that's why I'm putting it on my grandfather's knife. But I'm going to split this down and see if I can get some handle slab material out of this. So I'm using my axe as a froe to split out my log here. I'm using my hammer on the back of my axe. I really wouldn't recommend that. I'm in the process of making a wood mallet for that kind of thing, but that's an axe I don't really care about. So I got my two slabs of wood that are going to be the two handle scales for the knife. This oak was pretty tough. The chisel I got here is one that I found that was thrown out at a construction site. I sharpened it up, and it's been working out pretty good for me. I also like using my little CRKT burler axe to kind of take out bigger chunks of wood, but the chisel method you get a little more control on. So to make the handle scales, I sketched out the knife and drew scales in the proportion that I wanted them to be, cut that out of the design, and then I used those to trace the pattern onto the wood that was going to be the scales. And then I used my saw to kind of score in the wood and carefully chiseled out the wood so I didn't wreck my handle scales. So for the finer whittling tasks, I ended up getting a set of cheap chisels. They're not the highest quality, it's pretty soft steel, but it was good for what I was trying to use them for. And that worked out pretty nice. So I was able to kind of get a little more control in whittling out the shape of the handle scales. And then I also used them for whittling out the tang. And then to drill out the pinholes in the wood, I clamped them all together to line everything up, and then drilled the holes in. Then to line up the pinholes with the two scales, I pinned the scales together and then drilled them out one at a time. And trued them up to each other. Used my knife and my chisels for that. Then I also used one of my worn out work sharp belts to kind of as a sander, and that actually worked out really well. And then to carve out the tang, I pinned it in, traced it out, and that showed me what to carve out. So this little V-shaped chisel removed a small amount of material, and this was a slightly bigger trough one. And so I kind of would work my way around the outline of the tang, and then work my way up to bigger chisels and remove the central portion. So I just took my time, tried to work it real careful so as not to mess it up. After all this work, it'd be a shame if I just blew out the side of the knife and had to start over again. So I did a lot of it by hand, just for the control work, but I also had a little wood baton to help me move some of that material. You can see how tough that oak is. So here you can see that the batoning method was the chisel. You can still get good control, but it slips out at the very end, but it was a good method. So that was a shallower chisel, but it removed a broader piece of wood. So I'm truing up the back of the scales there with my Moore number 1. So I quenched the knife in my corn oil. Whoop, a little bit of a flare up there. But I got the edge, that's the main thing. That was a little bit of a debacle, but as long as it works. Seemed to take an edge. Here's the knife after heat treatment. So you saw me quench it in the corn oil, and then I tempered it in the oven, doing my triple temper, where I heat it up to about 375 to 400 degrees, leave it there for an hour, let it cool back down to room temperature, and do that total 3 times to soften it. And so the next thing I got to do now is take off all the fire scale, and so what I got for that is some clean vinegar. Since this is going to be a kitchen knife, I want to make sure this is keep this as clean as possible. And I'm just going to let it sit in here probably overnight, just to get off all the gunk on there. So I ended up using a pan because it fit the whole knife in there, because the whole knife obviously didn't fit in that little mason jar. And so back on the work sharp to kind of clean up the blade. And then one thing I forgot to do was kind of clean up the ricasso area, so kind of had a little double choil going on. And then on the work sharp, this time with the sharpening gizmo on there. So you can see with that rough belt that it's putting in that burr, pretty big burr on that. I like how in that lighting you can actually see it. And then I just went through the progressive belts, sharpened it up. So for the handles, once I had those sanded, I put a couple coats of dark stain on there. Okay, so I put a second coat of dark stain on these handles here, and then as kind of a to finish them up, I've got this flaxseed oil that I'm going to put on here. And my understanding is that flaxseed oil is just food safe linseed oil. So rather than use linseed oil on these handles, since this is going to be a kitchen knife more or less, I'm going to use the flaxseed oil to just give it that oil finish. That'll really bring out the wood. So now to glue these handle scales onto the tang, I used JB Weld, and I had my pins pre-cut and labeled, so I knew which ones went where. But something happened with that; they didn't quite line up right when it was all said and done, and I had to do some extra work after that. But so first thing I did is put the pins in and made sure there was JB Weld so that it would glue the pins to the knife.
On that, so I know my pins won't go anywhere.
And then one by one I put the handle scales on, so I made sure there was plenty of epoxy in the tang slot itself. And then put it on the tang. Trying to make sure I kept the pins even on each side. And so this method, I didn't have too much epoxy squirting out the sides of the knife, which is good because the JB Weld looks terrible when it's kind of leaking out. But this seemed to work pretty well. And then to kind of cover and conceal the gap in between the two slabs, I decided to try something out with this braided copper wire. So what I'm doing here is gluing in the wire ends, and then once the glue sets, I'm going to braid them and then glue it in. So I'm using my hand auger here to braid the two pieces of copper wire together. And so since I had the ends glued in, you can see how I was able to do that. So I snug those up and then basically laid the wire into the groove in between the handle scales. You can see how that fits in there pretty well. And then I mixed up some more JB Weld to glue the wire to the handles. It was kind of tricky to get the right leverage and pressure on the wire without damaging the wood. So what I did is I just glued up the top side of the scales, waited for that to set, and then I glued up the bottom half. You can see there trying to keep tension on the wire so that it would stay put. Here's the next day, the reverse side of the knife, trying to lay my JB Weld in there without getting it all over the rest of the handles. And I'm kind of working that, shaping that wire so that it fits the handle, and I clamp it up as I go. And so for the end of the wire, basically just cut that off, and then I unbraided the ends. And I tried to tuck those two little ends back into the handle scale itself and glue those down so they wouldn't come out. So for my first time trying something like this, it actually went surprisingly well. It was kind of a tricky thing to do. I'm not sure I'll do it again. But I think the I'm pretty happy with the way the knife turned out. Looks good, feels good. So I still had those little ends of the pins hanging out. So like I was saying, I don't know quite what happened, but I just kind of filed them down and then made them into little rivets so they wouldn't be sticking out. Okay, so here's the finished Farrier's Rasp knife. This thing is quite a monster. This is a frickin' beast. I don't know if this is quite what my grandpa had in mind, but this will definitely get the job done. So I'll have to find some cheese to try these serrations out on. I'm not sure how well that'll grate. The teeth got a little pushed over in the working of it, but overall I'm really happy with it. I like the kind of the subtle curve to the shape, and the handle came out well. I like the copper accents. Overall, just a really nice knife. It really doesn't feel like a kitchen knife. It feels more like some sort of fighting knife or something like that. So I guess if you had to, you know, repel an invasion of orcs as you're making dinner, it would definitely fit that purpose. But hopefully he enjoys it and doesn't cut a finger off while he's making stuff. But yeah, it's kind of a cleaver, so this will definitely take care of whatever tasks around the town. You know, stout edge, stout knife, so it's something that you can really use and abuse in the kitchen without worrying about messing up one of your good Wüsthoffs or something like that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, be more Viking.